For 2022, the LG G2 and Sony A80K are the best OLED models that you can get in 77-inch size. In this video, I'll be going over all the differences between the two of them and how similar they also can be. Now, normally the G2 wouldn't compete with the 80 series from Sony, as the G2 is LG's flagship. You can see on the left that it is capable of getting quite a bit brighter than the Sony on the right. However, at 77 inches, it's the best model that Sony offers. And also, that brightness advantage on the LG, if you use the accurate settings or get the televisions calibrated, that difference is only going to be visible in a very small amount of content. 97% of the time, they would look identical in terms of brightness. So for this comparison, the white point was adjusted on the LG to the same as the Sony. So any differences that you do see are purely brightness and the differences between their color styles between LG and Sony this year. The LG does push reds a little too hard, whereas on the Sony, the reds, yellows, and oranges lean a little too much towards green. So you'll notice throughout this comparison that skin tones are slightly too red on the LG and slightly too green on the Sony. Neither are correct, it's just the way that they do their colors this year. Though I will say the Sony is a little bit more off into green, and also green is more easily picked up than a little bit of extra red. Really though, the biggest difference between these two panels is going to be processing, and not necessarily what you might think about the processing, but mostly it's the tone mapping differences. So the G2 is around 900 nits in highlights versus mid 700s on the A80K. Now with tone mapping differences here is where we start to see our differences. So on the left, Cinema Home is not the accurate setting, but I'm just showing how it kind of blows out that highlight. And on the right with the Sony, Brightness Preferred does that as well. If you go to Gradation Preferred, that is the most accurate setting for the Sony, but even then, the sun itself is not visible unless you turned off the tone mapping setting, but that is not correct, as that lowers the peak brightness of the display and affects the OTF tracking. But you can see on the LG, in its accurate cinema mode, which is its correct mode, you can see the ring or the circle of the sun, not just have it completely blown out. Alright, so I'm going to change the exposure on the camera just so you can see the circle for the sun a little bit better. Now, the LG, its representation here is more accurate, being able to retain that little bit of extra detail in the brightest of highlights while still being brighter as well. Alright, now we'll move over to the Spears and Munzel disc, the scene with the horses, and we'll start with 4000 nit content here. Now, the A80K on the right has a more aggressive ABL, being at 133 nits full field versus the G2, which can do nearly 170 nits full field. But we can see as we change tone mapping options here how the brightness of the image changes between them, but also the detail that's visible. In their most accurate settings, the LG shows more of the detail, whereas the Sony leans a little more towards brightness, letting some of that detail go. However, on the LG, you can turn on dynamic tone mapping, which causes it to act more like the A80K, getting brighter and letting the detail clip. And then on the Sony, you can switch to brightness preferred, which pushes it even more towards clipping, just to try and push as much brightness at that point as possible. So now at 1000 nits for the same scene, you can see a lot more detail here. And if we turn on dynamic tone mapping on the LG, it slightly increases the APL of the scene, but does lose a tiny bit of detail in the process. On the Sony, going to brightness preferred from gradation preferred at 1000 nits really doesn't change too much, because brightness preferred will tone map up to about 1500, whereas gradation goes up to 2300, and it's a high APL scene. Alright, so now we're going to go into audio, and I'm going to play back and forth between the two with their speakers, and just let you listen to this for a few minutes.
refresh tomorrow.
I could do it.
You need rest. Anything else will have diminishing returns.
Sir Laszlo, he protected me in Sintra, and he said less than perfect means death.
Your stomach's growling loud enough to wake the dead. If that counts.
Hunger makes for good swords.
Also makes for shitty lunches. Siri. You are safe here. Was it the Black Knight again?
No.
If he's still haunting you.
Whose turn is it for lunch?
So when it comes to the audio, there's a clear bass advantage with the LG. However, the Sony does get voices louder. Now, I didn't have either of them turned up as loud as they go. They were just at normal listening volumes. And in that case, I really find that the LG was able to do Geralt's voice more accurately, at least compared to my normal surround sound setup. And you can tell the thuds from the sword were definitely deeper and better sounding on the LG. However, Sony really focused more on higher vocals, as it's designed to be used as a center channel speaker with their soundbar lineup, including the HT-A9. Alright, so next we're going to look at sharpness and clarity detail. So this is a scene that's 4K through a streaming device in SDR. And as we go through the reality creation settings, we'll see that Auto does a good job at not really messing with the image because it knows that it's a 4K source. There's not much for it to do. And the LG is just natively very clean and sharp. Now with reality creation, you can go to manual and start turning it up, but as you go much above 25, maybe 30 at the most, you really start to see the artifacts, the ringing, the fuzziness, everything that adds. So if you're going to use reality creation, I suggest leaving it on auto, because when you do get a 4K source, it pretty much doesn't really do anything. And as you drop down in quality, then it starts to add a little bit, but it never does it aggressively. And again, with this being a native 4K source, the LG is just presenting it very clean, no issues. And then as we drop down in resolution on other content, the LG also stays very clean and true to the source. However, there are options such as the super resolution tool that can sharpen up low resolution content like a Nintendo Switch or cable box. So basically it's a tie. The image processing here for sharpness, clarity, detail works pretty much the same on both. Digital noise reductions, again, clean source, doesn't really do anything if it's left on auto, which is what I would say most people should use, especially if you're going to be changing your content a lot and you don't know exactly what you're going to be watching. Auto typically does a good job at not doing anything when it doesn't need to, and it only applies very slight or mild effects when there is something for it to do. However, eagle-eyed among you may have noticed the few small single strands of hair on the left side of her head that are a little more visible on the LG. That is just its very clean native rendering of the image that is not being touched by processing. As soon as processing is added, very, very fine small details like that can be erased. So that is an example of the trade-off that you can have when you have processing trying to do too much to the image versus just giving it natively how it should be. Alright, so as I was discussing with the super resolution tool on LG, the way that it works is on 4K content, it's not going to do anything. It has to be a sub 4K source. And when you turn it on, it probably won't do anything unless you increase the sharpness slider with it, and you have to go above 20 on the sharpness for it to activate. So if you do have a Nintendo Switch or cable box, you can put that super resolution tool to low, medium, or high, and then turn the sharpness slider up to about 20 or 25, and then you'll see it just click, and then it turns on, and then you'll see the benefit of it. However, again, that is altering the source. It is an artificial enhancement of the original source, so that is up to you, and if you want to try and help a lower resolution source look better on your bigger screen. But as I just stated, when you start applying processing options, there's always a trade-off or a side effect, so artifacts will be implemented when using features like that. Alright, so now with both TVs set in the recommended way, with reality creation on auto, smooth gradation on low on both, and nothing else on. The only real differences is those few strands of hair, but you can also see that behind those strands of hair, where it's slightly fuzzy on the LG and a little cleaned up on the Sony, and that's the issue where you decide if you want less grain and noise, but you give up some detail for it. Alright, so now we're going to switch over to a lower resolution SDR content and just do a quick run through of the same thing and see how, again, processing very similar between them. Just do note that on the Sony, when you set a setting to off, that it's still not quite off, as we just saw. How you can even still see here on the left side, that back wall, you can see a little bit of noise reduction even though the noise reduction is not turned on. And then again, that can cause some very fine detail to disappear, but other people like it because it does reduce film grain and noise in the image, and some people prefer that. However, the LG, you do get those settings and you can turn that to low, medium, high, or auto and have similar effect as well. I would generally recommend not letting processing remove details so that you get a sharper, finer image, but again, some people just really don't like grain and noise, and in those cases I would suggest at least trying auto setting and letting the processor do its job. And now here we're going to use an actual pattern that more clearly can showcase artifacts from using these settings. However, do note that the focus on the camera could not get the entire image fully, so you can see a little bit of moire, those color rings on the left side of the LG. If I would have reduced focus more, then it would have been blurrier, but it would have gotten rid of the moire. So just ignore that left side right there. But if you look at the center circle, the lines are going across and up and down, and like the pink circle is an easy one that you can see too. You can see how not only the clarity settings but motion settings also affect the clarity and getting artifacts and issues from using these processing settings. Alright, so when it comes to the overall clarity and the sharpness, they're essentially even. There's just very minor differences in the controls that they give you and how they work. Again, the Sony, if you actually wanted to turn everything off, you can do that by using the graphics picture mode, as that will disable the processing, but then it disables the processing. So I assume most people are going to want to use that. That's typically why people buy a Sony, is for its processing that really does a good job of not having too many artifacts. The LG has caught up and has the better native sharpness in its movie modes. Alright, so now we're going to move over to motion. Now this was the biggest change I saw with LG for 2022. It is vastly better than last year, and as I scroll through cinematic movement, just imagine that's a 1 and natural's a 2 and smooth movement is a 3, and as I change smoothness on the Sony, you see that they are essentially identical for each step. It really looks like LG just took what Sony was doing with smoothness 1, 2, and 3 and matched them with those presets. Now, LG does offer the user selection where you have a 10-point scale, so you can adjust it on a little bit finer of a scale. However, the difference here is on LG, when you apply any true motion or smoothing, it will force Real Cinema to be on. Even if it is off and then you turn on true motion, that setting grays out and it'll say grayed out off, but it's actually on. On Sony, that's the equivalent of Cinemotion High. Cinemotion High you can adjust with the Sony, whereas again, the Real Cinema setting on LG automatically gets locked to on when you apply smoothing. Now what that does is it reduces the artifacts and makes the motion cleaner. However, there is a slight touch more soap opera effect or slight smoothing when those are on. So with the Sony, you have the option of setting Cinemotion to either low or off, and then you incur more artifacts when the Cinemotion setting is turned down to low or off. However, you get less soap opera effect look when you apply smoothness setting. So you get a little more control in that regard with the Sony, but again, the LG does have a 10-point scale, so if you want less artifacts and the cleanest motion with a touch of soap opera effect, That's what the LG provides with a more granular scale. And the Sony can do that as well, but with only the 3-point scale. Or on the Sony, you turn the Cinemotion down to low or off, and then you incur more artifacts and have a less clean motion, however with less soap opera effect. So now if you're someone who's not going to apply any smoothing at all, and you just want the cleanest motion with no soap opera effect, then the LG gets a tiny, tiny, tiny lead in that regard. If you are someone who wants absolutely no soap opera effect and a little bit of extra smoothness, then the Sony gets a little win in that regard. So again, they're a tie overall, but they just do things very slightly differently. And you can see in real content here with smoothness 1 on the Sony and cinematic movement on the LG, they look essentially the same. Again, they're a draw or a tie. Now, this is where Sony still has a step up above LG. However, it is also a fairly small step up. Again, ignore the camera moire on the very left of the LG, but if you look at the pink and green or red and green or the black and white gradients here, you can see LG smooth gradation low essentially equals the Sony with it off. And then if you put the Sony to low, that pretty much equals the LG at medium. However, as we learned earlier, a Sony set to off isn't necessarily off, it's doing something in the background. They're, again, close enough, not a big deal. Alright, now we can talk about gaming. So this is definitely where LG separates from the Sony, is with gaming. The G2 has HGIG at 1000 nits instead of 800 on the other LG models. The Sony, you can still set up its HDR in the consoles by turning gradation preferred to off, setting your settings in the console setting, and then turning gradation preferred back on. However, pretty much no matter what, gaming here is going to separate them with the brightness. That's going to be the biggest brightness advantage for the G2, is in gaming where you can set the parameters and you have bright highlights, and gaming just really showcases the brightness difference. Little highlights, APL, everything is just going to be brighter on the G2. And the Sony still has the logo detection dimming, which dims the entire screen, not just the logos, with no way of disabling it. So after a minute of a static element being detected, or the average scene level being the same, the Sony is going to dim at a slow rate. It's going to take approximately 5 minutes total, so 1 minute to start, and then about 3 to 4 minutes after that as it slowly dims down before it reaches the floor of as low as it will go. And that floor is 50% of its measurable brightness, which in reality would probably look like around 20, maybe 30%. But that's the way that it works. There's nothing you can do to disable it on the Sony. LG gives you user menu options to disable logo dimming or to set it to low or high. If you set it to low, it will dim by up to 15%, and if you set it to high, it will dim by up to 30%. Now, you can even go beyond that and go into the service menu on the LG and disable the ASBL dimming, which is when the average scene brightness stays the same for a certain amount of time. It can cause dimming as well. And there's also the global sticky reduction, or GSR, setting in the service menu. So there are multiple options on LG to stop it from dimming, some in the user menu, some in the service menu. Sony doesn't let you adjust any of it, and the games will dim down. Now, how much that matters depends on the person, because if it's not right next to another display showing that it's dimming by that much or in that game that often, then some people just don't notice it or they don't care, and that's going to depend on you. But if you are buying the TV for its brightness capability, then it would make sense that you want it to stay as bright as possible the entire time you're playing. That's one of those arguments that I've just never understood when it comes to the dimming in games on the Sonys, because Again, a lot of people want to buy a new TV that's brighter, but then if they don't care that it's dimming, it doesn't make sense to me, and it contradicts. So as I just showed right there, if you switch your input and switch back, it will reset it and it will bounce back to its full brightness capability. If there is a major scene change in the game, so for instance, you hit a long loading screen or something to that effect, then it will also reset the dimming. Also, just periodically while playing, it will just decide to start resetting, and it will try to brighten up some of it, but it may not go all the way bright. It's kind of hit or miss about how it recovers from the dimming, but it does do it, and then it dims back down, and it just doesn't stay consistent. And that's, I think, the biggest problem for me is 1 minute it's at full brightness, and a couple minutes later, it's not. It's just the back and forth. Now, showing in SDR, a lot of people complain that LG doesn't let you adjust peak brightness in SDR game mode. Okay, but the issue is on the Sony, which does let you set peak luminance. So right now, at the very start of this SDR game, the Sony was a little bit brighter, but by the time I land in Fortnite, they're about the same, and then over the next minute or two, the Sony's going to be even dimmer. So there is no SDR gaming advantage on the Sony either. And you'll see as I go through this match how it will darken and then kind of brighten up a few spots and then darken again. The easiest way to really see it is compare the green health bar to the LG, and at any moment how it's darker, and then as the weather changes, obviously the brightness in the game changes and so on. But you can see like right there, the health bars are back to about the same level, and then as I continue to play, the health bars change to get dimmer because I go into a different environment and there's different lighting, so the lighting does affect it. However, comparatively side to side, the LG is consistently brighter the entire time, except for in the few brief moments where the Sony decides to reset some of the brightness and it tries to go back to its full brightness until it starts to dim again. And that is what drives me crazy about trying to play games on the Sony WRGB OLEDs. Now, hopefully, from what we're hearing, the QD OLEDs don't do this anymore with the Sony A95K. But until I get one myself and get to run these tests properly and compare the gaming properly, I am not going to say that that is the case. However, it does currently appear that that may be the case. So I have spoken to a Sony rep before, and Sony is aware that this is happening. They know that it is, and it is their own implementation, but they don't want it to be that way. And they were going to be working on a fix, but there's nothing they can do with the models that are already out. It was going to be a fix for future models, and it appears that the QD OLED, at least with the heatsink, may be the answer to the dimming on the Sony OLEDs. Alright, so now we are going to move on to what I see as the biggest issue currently with the G2, and that is that its Dolby Vision is, for lack of a better word, broken. So cinema mode in Dolby Vision is the accurate mode typically on LGs, and right now there is almost no difference between cinema and cinema home, which on the Sony you would use Dolby Vision Dark for the accurate mode and Dolby Vision Bright for the less accurate but brighter daytime type mode with lifted EOTF. Cinema on the LG is still brighter than Dolby Vision Bright on the Sony. That is wrong. There is something wrong with the Dolby Vision on the LG. I am pretty sure LG will release a fix for this, but currently I've been waiting and waiting for that fix to finish my G2 review. Haven't gotten one yet, so I'm done waiting. The Dolby Vision is not right on the LG. Now, a lot of people will probably prefer it like this anyway, because it's not quite as lifted and wrong as Cinema Home, but it is definitely brighter than it should be. Now, normally, I would just run a measurement and be able to tell you exactly what's going on, but the Dolby Vision measuring in the correct way to measure Dolby Vision is broken on the LG's, all the 2022 models so far. We are waiting for LG to put out an update so that Dolby Vision can be measured and can see how the PQ is tracking. But you can clearly see that there is a huge brightness difference that shouldn't be like that. Alright, now the other bit of an issue with the G2. What you are seeing right now is a photo of the subpixels of pure black in HDR, and you can see that there is a bit of pixel activity in HDR. And if I switch to Dolby Vision, you see the same effect, although with dithering, so it's a little bit different. And then if I show you SDR, you see a lot of pixel activity. Now, this seems to be a decision made by LG to not have fully off pixels for black, so that the just above shades of gray from black, it can transition faster to those and not have the overshoot that Sony's can sometimes show. So I overexposed the camera greatly there to just show the glow, but now if I adjust the camera more normally, you see how visually it's really not that big of an issue. However, there is a black level difference between the two TVs. Alright, we're going to start closing out now. This is Inside Out. It's one of the little bit of content out there that really goes beyond P3 color. We can see they're essentially identical, and again, most of the time, these TVs will look very, very, very similar with very, very little difference, especially in brightness, unless the content calls for that extra brightness of the G2. However, if you are someone who doesn't care about the accuracy and you do switch the TVs to their brighter modes, then the G2 can separate itself more clearly. So for example, if you were to use Cinema Home with dynamic tone mapping on the LG versus brightness preferred on the Sony, the LG will show its brightness advantage in that case. But if you use the accurate cinema mode without dynamic tone mapping on the LG and you use gradation preferred and custom mode on the Sony, 97% of the time there's not really going to be any visible difference in the brightness, because content does not go beyond the full capabilities of even the A80K all that often. And even if it is a movie that does have a particular scene or maybe a couple of scenes that would show that difference, they're far and few between, and it's only a couple or few scenes of the movie overall. So you really got to ask yourself, is the price difference worth it? Because there is quite the price difference between these two TVs. Now, also, the other consideration is the LG C2, the step down from the G2. It also is capable of being brighter than the A80K, and it's around the same price or probably cheaper than the A80K. So in that case, why would you pick the A80K? Well, if you are someone who does not want to change settings, you're not going to get the TV calibrated, you want to just open it, switch the picture mode, and be done and not have to know nothing else, then that's what the A80K is great for. You just go to the custom picture mode and everything is correct, at least as correct as it can be out of the box. Now, with the LG, there are multiple things that you have to change when you get it for it to perform its best. The Sony will ask you if you want to disable eco mode during its initial setup. LG doesn't do that, it just applies it, and it's buried deep in the menus, and a lot of people won't know that. LG also, every HDR mode will have dynamic tone mapping on by default, and if you don't know to change that, then you're not getting the accurate representation of the content that you're watching. Sony makes it very easy and simple. I also much prefer Sony's remote and the Google TV operating system that Sony has over the WebOS of the LG. When it comes down to which one is more accurate without getting a calibration, well, as long as you make those changes on the LG and you put the Sony in custom mode, you can pretty much say it's a wash. There is too much panel variance between them. The LG does some things better than the Sony does some things better than the LG. HDR and Dolby Vision typically on the LG will be a little more accurate. SDR typically would be a little more accurate on the Sony. However, when it comes to near black handling, then there could be a little bit of crushing on the LG or a little bit of lift on the Sony. So really, they trade blows. There's no clear winner when it comes to which one is more accurate without a calibration. Now, all that said, if you just want my flat out recommendation for 2022, it would be get either the LG C2, unless you are willing to pay the extra for the wall mountability and the warranty, the 5-year warranty that the G2 gives you, as well as just that extra little push from the heatsink in the little bit of content that can show it. But for the most part, I would say the C2 is the main recommendation for most people, and follow my settings guide on what you need to turn off if you get it, so that way it can be in its most accurate state, or just get the television calibrated. The reason that I would pick the C2 over the A80K is the gaming, not only the features that it has, but the 4 HDMI 2.1 ports, which really isn't the biggest issue, but it still is nice to have. So really it's mostly because of the gaming side that the LG definitely gets it. However, if gaming doesn't matter to you, I still would suggest getting an LG either C2 or G2 over the A80K because of the tone mapping differences, the more accurate representation of the bright highlights on the LG really does it for me. That's my recommendation and main reason that I would pick an LG over the Sony in 2022. Everything else is close enough or slightly better on the LG, and there's only a couple of small things that the Sony does slightly better that don't outweigh that difference in the tone mapping, in my opinion, and that's why I would recommend getting a C2 or a G2 if you can afford that premium. Also, the other difference that really doesn't matter is the A80K has the semi-gloss type of coating on the screen, so at nighttime or in a dark room it makes absolutely real no difference. In a bright room it slightly diffuses lights, so if you want the more mirror-like look, glossy look, you have to get the LG, but if you want any kind of diffusing of lights in a bright room, then you should get the A80K. But really, that coating is so slight, it is almost not visible and almost really doesn't do anything, and for the majority of people should not be a consideration of which one you should buy. Alright, a little over half an hour. I could have kept going with more detail, but I think I pretty much encapsulated all the main stuff that you should know, and I hope that you liked this video. And if you made it this long to the end, if you could let me know which one you like better in the comments. And I thank you all for watching, especially if you made it this far, and I hope to see you all in a future video soon. Have a good one, and I'll see you in the next one.